Hello class, my name is Laura Spear and my partner is Faith Martinez, and we are presenting our project on bad news messages, which is Chapter 7 in BCOM 3304. So what are bad news messages? These are messages that we often hear on a daily basis. And at work, we are not exempt from these bad news messages. Whether we're dealing with a customer that's unhappy with a product or service, and we have to figure out a way to please them or get through to them, possibly an unhappy employee, disgruntled employee, we have to work with them, work through the situation. There's so many different examples of bad news messages that we hear and deal with on a daily basis. So think back to a moment, whether it's at your current job, a previous job, or even you as a customer. Think about possibly an unhappy or unsettling experience, and think about how you handled that experience. Possibly if you were a customer, how the other person handled the experience for you, and were you happy with the outcome? We all deal with bad news on the daily basis. If you've ever worked in customer service, you know that bad news happens just about every day. Dealing with a disgruntled customer, a customer that maybe isn't happy with a service or product, and we have to figure out ways to please them and mend that bond that is possibly broken. So think back on some examples that you've dealt with at your current job, previous job. What are some examples that you've had to deal with yourself? Some examples of bad news that we may have to relay are price increases to customers or vendors, possibly breach of private information. We've all gotten those emails or letters in the mail that are possibly our information has been breached, even an insurance claim denial. Those are all examples of bad news messages. When dealing with bad news messages, the best practice are two different strategies. We have indirect and direct strategies. Direct strategies are typically used for bad news that possibly isn't going to harm the other person, bad news that maybe the other person might overlook. And indirect strategies are strategies that we may use for maybe a more challenging situation. So with a direct strategy, you have your bad news, your reasons, and your pleasant close. And with indirect strategy, you have a buffer because it is a little bit more sensitive. You have your reasons, your bad news, and your pleasant close. In this image, you will see the bullet points and the differences between the direct strategy and the indirect strategy. The direct strategy is not damaging. It may be overlooked. It could be preferred by the recipient and requires firmness. In the indirect strategy, it could be personally upsetting. It may provoke a hostile reaction. It could threaten a customer relationship and is often unexpected. So as you can see, the key differences is one is less harmful than the other. Here's an example of a direct strategy email. In this email, as you will read, you will see that this person who received this email did not get the job that they had applied to. It is very direct. It does not really give you an open conversation. However, it does give you a few guidelines for any future job opportunities. Here is another example of a direct strategy. The policyholder in this email was denied an insurance claim. There is not much that could be done on this regarding this situation. One thing to keep in mind when relaying bad news is to set some goals in place. Some things to consider are to explain the bad news clearly and entirely. Do not leave room for any assumptions. Express the bad news with sensitivity and empathy. Place yourself in the other person's shoes. Think about how you would like to receive the bad news and express it doing so. Protect your professional appearance. Do not let anger, frustration, any of those things get the best out of you. Be unbiased in your approach. Remember that you are also imperfect. Your company also makes mistakes, or you as a customer could also be susceptible to errors. We are all human and we are all trying to do our best. Maintain pleasant associations. If the customer or vendor, anybody is upset, remember that the approach is to work on those relationships rather than getting your point across. It is better to build healthy relationships and have open dialogue and room for improvement than to cut people off, cut ties off just because of small errors. Everything could be fixed, every situation could be learned from, and we can all improve in many other ways. Here's an image of the 4-part indirect strategy for bad news. You will have your buffer, your reason, your bad news, and your closing. In the buffer, you often open with a neutral and meaningful statement that does not mention the bad news. Think of it as easing your way into the conversation. Then you have your reason. It could be a possible breach of information. The bad news, where you reveal the bad news without emphasizing what it actually is. Provide an alternative or compromise if possible. If, let's say, it is something that you are no longer able to provide to your customer, let them know. We will not honor this contract, however, we have another option in place. And then close with a personal and professional statement. Something like, we look forward to your continued service. We thank you so much for your years of continued loyalty to our brand, and avoid referring to the bad news that you mentioned. Emphasize your gratitude for the other party. Here's a slide with an example of the indirect strategy. You will see in this bad news message a rate increase. It is a rate increase by 14 to 18%. I'm sorry, to 15%. Now this does open with a buffer, reason, the bad news, and the pleasant close. This email is very well laid out. It does give the customer a sense of gratitude from the vendor. It does give them the clear information of the price increase, and they did mention that they are not susceptible to any price increases or inflation. They are just like every other vendor who is dealing with the same situation at the moment. So this is a great example of something we could use, or we do often see in today's world. And here is another example of the indirect strategy. This is a data breach email, and we have all seen these. We have all received them in the last few years. This email is very direct, it is to the point, and it explains the steps needed in order to resolve this issue. This is an excellent video of a doctor clearly and empathetically relaying some bad news to a patient. This is a very sensitive topic, and she does explain the information very sensitively, empathetically, and she does go through all the 4 steps. I will not play this video, but you may play it on your own, and you will see that this doctor did an excellent example or video of how to relay bad news messages. So there are some things that we do need to consider when we are delivering bad news that could possibly react a hostile or sensitive reaction. With our buffer, you might want to consider giving some compliments, some appreciation, agreement, some facts, even an apology. with the reasons, cautiously explain what is going on. Provide positive words, maybe company policy or explanation to why they are hearing the bad news. And in the bad news, embed placement with a passive voice. Try to possibly give some compromise or any alternatives that you could think of. And end it with a close, a pleasant close. Think of maybe some well wishes if this is a sensitive topic or something that you are no longer able to honor. Possibly offer some promotions, some freebies, something that they will feel that the bad news is outweighed by the positivity that you are providing. Now, we do live in a very different world. Most of our interactions are now online. Businesses now have online comments or messages that they do need to respond to, and that is something that we do want to consider. When we do have some bad news messages online or social media, we do want to provide a phone number or email for customer service. You also want to give a description of the bad experience and let them know where your company fell short. Explain why and how the problem occurred and how you can work to resolve it. Assure them that it won't happen again. And promote goodwill by providing maybe your personal phone number or customer service phone number or email, something that makes them feel that even though this is an online correspondence, that they are equally as important and valued as a face-to-face experience. On this slide, you will see some guidelines for responding to online rejection. You have your buffer, your reason, your bad news, and your close. You may go through the guidelines and see what is the best example or approach for your situation. Just because it is online does not mean that we do not have to respond. Remember that our online presence is just as important as our face-to-face or personal interactions. Here is an example of a negative online review. Whether you've been someone who left a negative review or you're someone that has had to respond to a negative review, remember that responding to negativity online is equally as important as pleasing our customer face-to-face. The way we respond to social media or online reviews is just as important. We want to make our customers feel as if they are valued. Just because the review is online does not mean that we can dismiss this. Okay, and this might be one of the toughest things to do, delivering bad news in person. When you are doing this, you do want to make sure that you are thoroughly prepared for this conversation. One, you want to gather all your information prior to a meeting. You want to rehearse what you are going to discuss in the meeting and explain the situations from past, present, and future. Consider taking a partner or a witness to the meeting. If the meeting could potentially be somewhat perceived or received with hostility, you do want to consider taking a partner or a mediator to this meeting. That is very important. Think about the timing of the meeting. I know that might seem so minimal or dismissive, but timing could be everything. Be patient with the reaction that is necessary. If you are giving someone maybe some guidelines or some opportunity changes, do remember that it does take time for these things to change, for people to change, for people to grow. So you do want to be patient and seek the reaction that you are possibly trying to get. And lastly, remember to keep your composure. Your professionalism is everything. Bad news are opportunities for improvement. In this image, you will see a guideline for providing bad news to employees, whether you've had to do this yourself or you've been in that situation yourself. You never know when you will need this. You might need it to possibly even give to one of your colleagues, one of your coworkers. There are so many ways that we can help each other out. Even though this is negative news, it could be seen as something positive. Remember that bad news can be a turning point. So in my experience, I have had lots of bad news throughout my work life. One of the more recent examples is a new employee that was hired on my team. She started off really strong. She quickly fell into a slump. I noticed maybe one to 2 months into her hiring, she quickly started changing. She started calling in just about every other day. She had a lot of personal situations going on, making her very distracted at the office, and she was on her personal phone a lot. So obviously, I'm just like everyone else. I do not want to address the bad news. However, this is part of my job. So I did address with her the changes that I noticed, and even though I was uncomfortable, I had to do it because that is part of my job, and it's important that I do keep her accountable. So what I did is I emailed her a list of all the items that she needed to improve on, some changes that needed to be made. I was very direct, but also very compassionate, because I know that this is a new role for her, and she is a single mother juggling parenting, 3 children, and learning this new role. So I assured her that I know she's fully capable because she's been doing excellent, the first 2 months. And it just seems like she's temporarily distracted, and, we can get back to where we were. And thankfully, she did receive the information very positively. She did make some changes, and we are working through this. So I'm very thankful that she did see the bad news with a optimistic perspective, and she was very willing to receive the information. So I'm very thankful about that. Faith did experience a bad news message. On the flip side, she did experience bad news with her employer. She was eagerly anticipating a role change, a promotion. However, she did not get the promotion she was anticipating. So we've all had situations like this. We've had emails of denial, and this was very hurtful for Faith. However, she was able to overcome her feelings, and she did branch out and grow elsewhere, which is also a great experience for her. Here's a quick little assessment to challenge you to see what you have learned in this presentation. What is not part of the direct strategy bad news approach? A, bad news, B, reasons, C, apologize, or D, pleasant close? The answer is C, apologizing. Apologizing is not part of the direct strategy approach. What is an example of the indirect strategy bad news? A, upsetting news, B, could potentially cause a harsh reaction, C, may be overlooked, or D, unexpected. And I apologize, I accidentally selected the wrong one here. It is actually D, which is unexpected. Typically, indirect strategy bad news are bad news that we do not expect. It could be maybe a job loss, a job promotion that we didn't get, maybe some rate increases, a claim denial, something that is actually bothersome or that is upsetting to the vendor, client, customer. Thank you everyone for joining our presentation, for taking part in it. I hope you have learned some key points and valid ideas with presenting bad news. Remember, we are not immune to receiving bad news or providing bad news. And as we are doing so, let's remember to clearly and effectively and empathetically present the bad news as best as possible. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.